Hi, everyone. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Cool. So my name is Ishan. I'm a sophomore in high school, and I'm presenting from San Francisco. I've always been interested in computer science and geography, which are usually two pretty separate things. But this topic was essentially the perfect combination between the two. It's called AI geolocation. I'll explain that in a second. And in my research, I worked on creating and comparing data sets to optimize it. So first of all, what's geolocation? Essentially, it's the process of analyzing an image and figuring out where it was taken, right? Where are its coordinates on a map? So for example, if we have this picture of the Golden Gate Bridge, it's pretty obvious that this was taken in San Francisco. But then if you imagine that instead we had some random field in Canada, it would probably be a lot harder to guess. As an example, like in a practical sense, if you imagine that the CIA had an image of a suspect or a hostage, and they wanted to figure out where that person was, they would use geolocation. So maybe if there was something in the background, like a building or a sign, they could try to use that to figure out where it is. And the goal of my research was essentially to teach a computer how to do this task. That just means I give it an image and it tells me where it thinks it was taken. Now, in a perfect world, this is pretty simple, right? The computer would just memorize every place in the world. It would just say, this image looks exactly like this place. But obviously, we don't have a database of every possible picture in every possible place. And even if we did, it would be way too much data for a computer to search through. So as you might have expected, that's where the machine learning comes in. Basically, instead of memorizing the images, we're feeding a bunch of data through an algorithm so that it starts to recognize patterns between them. And eventually it'll be like, this arrangement of pixels is most similar to what I've seen in this place. And because we don't expect it to find the exact coordinates, this becomes a classification problem. And in this context, that means splitting the map into regions so that instead of guessing an exact number, it's guessing one of those finitely many regions. And the goal of my research was essentially to figure out what's the best way to define those regions. How can we make it so that the computer's guesses are as accurate as possible? So let's see what a few of those possibilities look like. Oh yeah, so first of all, to simplify the problem a little bit, we're only going to consider images in the United States rather than the entire world. And the first way to define regions is by using the regions that are already set up for us, which are, of course, state boundaries. So that means the computer is predicting this image is in New York or this image is in Florida or something like that. The second method is to use grid-based regions. This one's also pretty simple. You're just splitting the map into square-shaped regions based on the latitude and longitude. The important feature of this method is that every cell is the same size. So while Texas and Vermont are different sizes, grid cell 1 and grid cell 15 are going to be roughly equal. And then this last one is a little more complicated. We'll get into the details in a second, but essentially it's kind of like grid cells, but it's instead of having the same area, they all have the same number of images. So maybe a small region in the middle of a city would have more images or data than a region that's a lot larger but happens to be in like a desert. And to generate this last data set, I used an algorithm called k-means to assign each image to a cluster. We don't need to get into the specifics of the algorithm, but you can see pretty clearly what it does here. So if you look at the unlabeled points on the left, just imagine these as our images, where their position roughly corresponds to where they are on a map. And then the point of the algorithm is to generate a specified number of centroids, which are these little X's. And that's three centroids in this case, so that the images in that group will just be the closest points to the centroid. All right, so now let's get into how we actually create these data sets for the computer to train on. The main structure for geographic data is called a GeoJSON, which is just a set of features that describe something on a map. So for example, a feature could be a point. A point is just one pair of latitude, longitude coordinates. And that could represent a building or an address or any one particular location. A line is just 2 points. That would usually represent a street or a border. And then a polygon is just a set of points that defines an area. So for example, this polygon on screen is supposed to define the city of San Francisco for a computer. All right, and using those building blocks, you can create much more complex data sets like the borders of a state. So here's an example of taking the official borders of a few different states and then downloading them as GeoJSONs. And then what I did is combine them into one big data set, which from there you can specify how many images or image samples you want in each of those. So here you can see on the right, I specified 100 images in California, 100 in Texas, 100 in Florida, and 100 in New York. And for consistency, all these images are taken from the same source, which is Google Maps, which uses roughly the same camera to reduce variability and things like that. So after creating these data sets, I trained a standard machine learning model on each of the three data sets. So that's states, grid cells, and clusters. And this is what happened. Well, the answer was there wasn't much difference at first. These are some of the graphs of loss and accuracy as the model trained and retrained. And all three variations produce pretty much the same curve. It's approximately logarithmic, which is about what you'd expect. It learns fast in the beginning and then sort of tapers off until it converges at about 80% accuracy. So does that mean there are no differences? And to answer that question, we actually have to redefine our notion of what accuracy is to better fit the context of our problem. So remember that since we're doing classification, the default for accuracy is just, did you guess the right region? For instance, if you look at this example on the left, the location was somewhere in Wyoming, and the computer misidentified it as Colorado. In the example on the right, the location is still in Wyoming, but this time the computer thought it was in Georgia. Now, obviously, the first guess is a lot better than the second one, but they're both counted as simply incorrect. And the problem with that is that it's not exactly a binary, right? Even if we made an incorrect guess, there are different levels of incorrect, and we need some way to quantify that. So instead of taking accuracy to mean how often were we in the correct state, grid cell, or cluster, we can assign it a number that represents how close it was to the correct location. So in this example, when it guesses Wyoming, for example, we're just going to take the geographic center of Wyoming and calculate the distance from there to the correct location. And then clearly the guess on the left is a lot better than the one on the right. So with that in mind, we're going to recalculate our results with this new metric and see what happens. And it turns out that with this new measurement of accuracy, we can see that there's actually a pretty significant difference. So the state model and grid model were about equal. The grid model was only slightly better. And they both guess about 100 miles from the correct location on average. That sounds like a lot, but it's actually pretty impressive considering how big the US really is, right? Like 100 miles is barely the distance from LA to San Diego. But then the cluster model did even better and was just 75 miles away from the correct location on average, which is about 20 to 25% better. So there you go. This was essentially the main takeaway of our analysis, which is that out of these three sort of fundamental methods of geographic classification, the cluster-based regions were the most effective for our data. And I guess the natural follow-up question is why, right? What about this clustering method makes it so useful? Well, the main difference between the cluster model and the other two models is that every single cluster has the same amount of data. In other words, while Google Maps has a different amount of data or images, you could imagine in like the state of Texas compared to the state of Delaware, the clusters are defined to be evenly distributed. And to understand why this property has that effect, we have to do a little math. So imagine the following probabilistic scenario. Let's say we have 10 balls spread across two buckets, and I'm trying to find the orange one. The orange one is like the image that we feed into the computer, and it's going to tell us, well, if we assume that the model is completely perfect, it'll tell me without fail which bucket contains the orange ball. Now, if the balls are placed at random, this means it'll choose the first bucket 80% of the time and the second bucket 20% of the time. And each time it's narrowing down our remaining options, which is what we care about, to 8 balls or 2 balls respectively. And that means the expected value of the remaining options is 8. That's just this calculation down here. So we have 6.8, it's 6.8. So we have 6.8 options left on average. But then in the other example, on the right, where the balls are spread evenly, we narrow it down to 5 options no matter which bucket we choose, right? If it's in this bucket, we eliminate all of the ones in the other one. If it's in this one, we eliminate all of the ones in the first one. And if we do the same calculation, we see that indeed the expected value is lower. So sort of zooming back into the context of our problem, we can look at the left side as more of a state-based or grid-based approach, where the data is spread unevenly, and then on the right side, the cluster-based approach, where the data is spread evenly. So just to recap, we compared 3 methods of classification, which were state boundaries, grid cells, and k-means clusters. And we found that out of these, clustering seems to be the best strategy, at least when we restrict our focus to Google Maps in the United States. You can imagine different scenarios where you might get different results. So for example, if there existed a country where every state mandated a different house color, so like in California, there were only blue houses, and in Oklahoma, there were only red houses. I'm not sure why that would come about, but if you could imagine that, then the machine learning algorithm would probably have a much easier time establishing patterns between those states rather than between clusters. Yeah, and there are also definitely a bunch of other algorithms or a bunch of other methods of sort of defining regions as we did that could produce different results, maybe even better results. What people tend to do in the industry when they're actually making these AIs to guess images is they'll define custom-made regions where each image or where the images in one region are most likely to exhibit patterns or similarities among each other. Now, this only works, of course, if you have a lot of time and energy, right? You can't go defining regions if you have a completely new data set. You have to study it, and there are millions of images. So out of the 3 that we compared, which are relatively easy to set up, clustering seems to be the best. But yeah, that's about it. And as you can see, there are a lot of interesting open questions in the field, and I'd love to work more on this topic in the future. Thanks.
Thank you, Ishan, for that great presentation. And we have a question from Pranay. Pranay, can you switch on your camera and ask the question?
So I saw that like the biggest challenge would be building a data set for so many things and places across the US or across the world. Have you explored leveraging social media to improve the training data set for the model? There's millions of photos every day and it's almost free. So how can you take advantage of it?
That's an interesting idea. I think there definitely has to be some way of utilizing social media to create data sets. I guess the main worry I would have about that is that we don't really want the AI or the machine learning model to pick up on differences between, like, let's say we had 2 different cameras of really different quality. We don't want it to think that all the images of this quality belong to this location, or like something that has to do not with the image itself, but the way it was taken, or like taken in this format, something like that. Or maybe there's like a blur in the corner on your camera and there's no blur on mine. So we don't want it to pick up on those random things. And I think just strictly using Google Maps or like one photographer reduces that variability, at least to a certain extent. But I do think that, if there was some way to leverage social media and just all the data that's already out there, it would make the process of training a lot easier.
Thank you for the question, Pranay. Any other questions from the audience? I have a question, which is, you used 3 methods and that you tested versus each other. How do you pick those 3?
So those were basically, as I said, like there are ways to sort of define custom-made regions, and that's what people tend to do. But these are sort of these are three ways that basically through my research I've seen people have used in other fields or for like similar problems to this one, that are simple enough that you can just sort of define them almost instantaneously without having to do any thinking or like human work. So like grid cells, it's just like equations, right? You just have latitude, longitude, and you can say exactly which image the grid cell is going to go into. But if you have your own regions, you can't really just take the point. You have to actually spend some time thinking or write an algorithm to put an image in a certain category. But yeah, there are definitely more ways that I could have looked at this. These were just the three that I thought would be statistically interesting.
Makes sense. And what was the hardest part of the project, technically?
I think the hardest part was sort of, I guess I hit a little bit of a roadblock um, when I initially generated the results and I saw that they were about the same in terms of accuracy. And I had to sort of figure out a workaround to better fit the statement of the problem, which is actually we want to know how close we were, not just how correct or incorrect we were.
Makes sense. Any questions from the audience for Ishan? If not, I have a final question, which is you mentioned that you want to keep working on this. What would be the next stage of development?
One thing that comes to mind, I thought of an interesting idea, which is there's another way to define sort of regions, which is basically if you train the model on say like one of these three basic ones, like state-based or grid-based or cluster-based, then you could define new regions based on not where the correct answers were, but you can define new regions based on where the model guessed. And then you have regions where all the images are probably kind of similar to each other, because that's at the end of the day, that's what we want to get. And if you use regions that the computer told you it thought were similar, maybe that could lead to potential improvements in pattern recognition.
Sounds great. Well, Ishan, thank you for the great presentation and the great work.